Hello, and welcome to Humanities 211, Masterpieces of the Western World. This is a course that surveys literature in the Western world from antiquity up to the Renaissance. It also studies how Western civilization developed over that time and the history of Western civilization and the role literature plays in the formation of Western civilization as a social construct. This is our first lesson, so we have quite a bit to cover, as you can see from the title here. I'm going to go over the fundamentals of the course, as well as the theme for the course, and the first literary text that we are studying, which is the Iliad by Homer, which is a representation of ancient Greek epic poetry. So quite a bit to cover in this first lesson. It'll be longer than some of the others for that reason, but I want to give you a really great overview of the class so that you know what to expect, kind of like you would have in a traditional setting on the first day of class. Part of what's going on here is that this is an online course, which is reflected in this image. And the reason I bring this up is that I've taught a number of online courses over the years and know from experience that online learning is very different than traditional learning. And it can be really beneficial, but it poses its own unique set of challenges. So part of what I want to go over in this introduction to the course is what those are and how best one can succeed in an online course. So that brings us to our first slide. A piece of advice I give to all of my students in online courses is to plan out 3 things. I think 3 is a good round number. At the start of the course, 3 strategies to help you succeed. You can certainly come up with your own, and I recommend it, but I wanted to give you some here that I think work really well for me personally. The first is to manage your time well. This hasn't always been my strength, and it's a difficult thing to do, but it's even more important in online learning. And so really think through when you're going to work on the class, how much time you need to devote to the class, set that aside. Always overestimate. That's something I struggle with. I think an activity will take me an hour or 2. It ends up taking 3 or 4 hours. It throws everything off. So at the start of the course, these first few weeks, give yourself much more time than is necessary in your schedule. And then when you get used to the hang of it, get used to the course and how it works, then you can start planning more specifically how long it'll take you. And that brings us to the second point. Always set some time aside. If you're taking an online class, you're probably like me and you worked all through or you're working all through your undergraduate years of college and probably maybe you have families or kids or other things, other responsibilities. It can be very easy to put off homework until late at night or other times of day where it's not convenient. And that doesn't quite work the same. I mean, one should never do that, but it really doesn't work quite the same in an online course because homework's much more intensive in an online course because it accounts for both the time you'd normally be doing homework and the time you'd normally be in class. So you have to set aside even more time. So if you work all day, carve out a certain time at night or something like that, a couple hours here or there, work it into your schedule. The last one is to stay up on due dates. Canvas has a really efficient calendar. If you click on the syllabus tab on the side of Canvas, that keeps track of due dates for you. Maybe put them in your planner, or if you keep a schedule, something like that. Whatever you need to do, but stay up on the readings, stay up on the due dates. Don't skip an assignment. Don't fall behind. Work ahead if you can. Whatever you can do so that you don't fall behind and you stay up on things. So those are my 3 tips for success with online classes. And now we're going to turn our attention to some things specifically for this class. So this is a reading intensive course because we're surveying literature. So you don't have a ton of homework beyond the reading. But we're reading very old pieces of literature from a wide variety of cultures. So they can be difficult to read at times. Very different from the types of things you're probably used to reading. So these are some tips I have to help you with the reading. Read carefully, read slowly. And, something that happens to me a lot when I read is my eyes kind of glaze over the page and I'll read a whole page and not realize what happened on it. It's easy to just press on, but go back, reread anything that seems confusing, anything that you miss. This textbook has really great footnotes, so be sure to always read those. It's easy to skip the footnotes, but don't skip them. And I would say take notes of your own as you read too. Um, the last point down there says that writing something down is much more helpful to remembering it than reading it, hearing it, seeing it. So take notes while you read. Take copious notes in the side of your anthology, and that'll help you retain the information you read much better. I'm also going to post reading questions to Canvas each week, ideally a week before the lesson is due, if not sooner. And these will just be a couple of questions, very kind of general things related to the text for you to think about as you're reading the text. So a couple of questions to think through as you're reading, and I'll also incorporate these into the slides, and you can try to answer them, as you're taking notes as you read. Take notes specifically on these questions. A lot of these texts are very different from things we'd read today, and the cultures they come from are very different too. And because I've taught these and studied these for a number of years, I have some lenses or some ways in, so to speak, to these cultures and these texts. And so I'll try to give you questions that can help you focus in your reading, give you specific things to think about, so that your reading is very intentional, and hopefully that'll help you understand the content better. The third point here is about the lectures themselves, what you're watching right now. I would say to go very slowly there, to pause the lecture, take notes. I put a lot of questions on the screen, hoping that you'll pause the lecture and maybe try to answer the question yourself or take some notes on it before I go more into what I interpret as the answer. So treat the lectures like they're reading. Don't just treat it like you're watching a movie or binging a Netflix show or something. Pause it, take notes, really absorb the material. Now I want to go over some of the requirements for the class, specifically the weekly lessons. If you're not familiar with an online class, or you haven't taken this kind of online class before where you're doing a lot of reading and whatnot, you might not be familiar with the format. And so there's 3 things I expect you to do every week. There'll be a reading assignment, there'll be a lecture, and then the discussion boards. So it's pretty straightforward, and if you go into the discussion board assignment, I'll always list the reading and have the lecture video there for you to watch, really easy access. But all 10 weeks, each week out of the quarter, there'll be those 3 things to do. So be sure to do them and do them in that order. I'd like you to come to the text first and then watch the lecture so that you have your own impressions of it before you hear what I have to say about it. And obviously you need to answer the questions to get points for the class, for your participation. Which brings me to my next slide. When I teach this class on campus, it's very heavily discussion based, as I think any literature class should be. Students sharing their interpretations of the works, me sharing my interpretation of the work, and building on each other, and hearing what the other person or other people in the class have to say, and building from there, that leading us to new ideas, new directions, new ways of interpreting the text. It's really enjoyable. So I try my best to recreate that experience online. And so much of the grade traditionally for a class like this is that in-class participation, that the discussion board posting is a big part of the grading here. So each week I'll have a set of questions for you to choose from. You pick a question and answer it. Your response should be 250 words. So that'd be about like 1 page double-spaced in a Word document. Sometimes there'll be multiple points or kind of smaller questions within the question, so be sure to answer it fully. And the third thing I expect you to do is use close reading to defend your answer, which means actually cite a passage of language from the literary text and explain how that language supports your point. And that can be part of the 250 words, or you can certainly go over it. And we'll talk more about close reading as we get further in this lesson and we look at a literary text. But basically, this class is teaching you how to read critically, how to read a piece of literature, interpret it, make a claim about what its meaning is. And when you make a claim about the meaning of a literary work, you have to defend that claim. And there are different ways to go about that. And one thing I find students often like to do is to summarize the plot and connect the events in the plot to their argument. Now that can work, but it's usually almost always never as effective as quoting actual language, something the characters or the narrator says, because then you have the author's words right in front of you, and you can connect that to your argument and explain how that proves your argument. So we call that close reading. And because the posts are a little bit longer than, say, an English 101 or a class that's not as reading and discussion heavy, I expect that close reading to be part of your response. Answer the question and then defend your response by doing the close reading. There's two parts. Next thing here is there's two parts to every discussion board post. Your initial response and then your response to a classmate. So each lesson is worth 4 points, and there are 10 lessons for 10 weeks of the class, so it adds up to 40 points or 40% of your grade total. And 2 of those points are for your initial response, which is what I just described, and then another 2 points are responding to your classmate. That doesn't have to be as long for obvious reasons, so about 150 words, half a page. And really, here, you're just kind of building on the discussion, like we would in a classroom. So, in a classroom, if I made a comment or I posed a question and a student responded, that might make you think of something to say, and then you would respond and we would build on each other. That's what I'm hoping for at the discussion board. That's why I require you to respond to your classmates. So don't just say something, something I see a lot on these kinds of posts when I teach these classes is, great post, or I love what you said here. I'm going to more depth than that. That doesn't really advance the discussion. Challenge or complicate what the student said, or add something that builds on it. Maybe you quote a passage that's relevant to it that they didn't quote. Maybe it makes you think of a question and you pose a question. Anything along those lines is great. Something that moves the discussion forward more. In a classroom, if someone made a comment, you wouldn't say, great comment, I love that, in front of the class. You'd probably either not speak up, or if you did, you'd have something that advanced the discussion. So that's really the only criterion I'm looking there for when I evaluate your responses to classmates. Each post is worth 2 points. So if you fulfill these requirements, that's what we call a substantive post, and you'll get the full credit. If you do something that's worthwhile, but it doesn't fully meet these requirements I've just outlined, you'd still get partial credit, half credit, 1 point. And if it really doesn't meet if you do the post, but it just falls short, way too short, you'd get 0 points. And obviously, late posts or not posting would be a 0. I will go into the discussion board when I have the opportunity and comment on people's posts, but not giving them feedback on the quality of their posts, trying to advance the discussion myself, posing interesting questions for further discussion. My goal is to do that a couple of times a week. I might not always meet that goal, but I'll do my best. But when I'm actually grading the post and inputting points, I won't make any comments there. It should be fairly obvious. 90% of the time, students either get full credit or 0. And if you ever get 1 point or 0, but you did the post and did it on time, that is when I will give you some feedback and say, hey, this didn't quite meet the requirements. Here's why. Here's what I expect you to do next time instead. But the majority of the time, students either don't do the post or they get full credit. So you won't see a lot of comments on there in terms of feedback from me unless you really need to improve. Hopefully that's clear. If you have any questions at any point, always feel free to email me or contact me. I want to talk a little bit about how the class is set up and the way I approach the study of literature. Every professor has what they call a teaching philosophy, a framework that guides their teaching. They don't just come in and wing it, so to speak. I mean, they might, but they have some kind of philosophical belief about how the class should be taught that informs what they do when they go in there. Some professors don't always make that overt. They just come in and teach, and the students don't necessarily know what the framework is behind that. My opinion is I should be very upfront about that. There's more than one way to interpret literature. I'm simply giving you what I believe, after years of studying it and working with it, is the best, most effective, most useful approach, especially for students who are just starting out. In a Gecker class like this, where you probably don't have a ton of experience analyzing literature, I think this philosophy really works. And so I also call it a learning model, because it's a philosophy I believe in, but I also bring it into the classroom and use it to structure class. And it'll structure our PowerPoints and discussions on here as well in the online version. My philosophy of studying literature can be summed up in one short statement, which is the first point there. Culture influences literature, while literature simultaneously influences culture. So what this means is that literature isn't composed in a vacuum. The things going on in the world around the author influence the text, shape the text in some way. But at the same time, literature itself is very powerful, and it can influence cultural, social change. And so it's a cyclical process where those two things work simultaneously. An event like World War I greatly impacted the writers who were writing at that time and completely changed the way literature was written. But at the same time, major social changes and movements have been brought about, through the power of the written word. Abraham Lincoln attributed the Civil War and the goal to end slavery to Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a little bit of an exaggeration, but it illustrates the point. And so the way this comes into play in the classroom is, with the first point, I like to go through the history and show you the history, the culture surrounding this text, to ideally give you a better understanding of the text. And then also, we should learn something from this, is the other half of it. It shouldn't just be we're reading these because they're these famous classical works. They should have something of value, something they offer to us. And so those are the two sides of this philosophy. And I have a structure, process through which I take students when I go through texts in class that follows this philosophy. The first two things aren't as directly related to it here, reading questions and recall. They are, but they're more pragmatic tools to help you. So I already discussed the reading questions, and that's listed first here because that's something you'd actually do, outside of the lecture, outside of the discussion board while you're reading. But I will bring them back in during the lecture. And then recall is something I do at the start of class when I teach a class on campus, where I have a couple of questions to launch the class and just kind of have you recall some things we learned last time. And the idea is later on, when we're talking about the current text, I'll have some questions that relate to those. Literature isn't written in a vacuum, like I said earlier, and so the literary works that have come before influence the ones that come after them. And as we see through this course, we'll see Western civilization develop. The changes that happen, and the literature, documents and even influences some of those changes. So we're not simply going to jump from one text to the next without looking at the connections. And so that's the purpose of recall. After reading questions and recall, I have a formula set of questions down here, types of questions that follow this learning model of culture influences literature while literature influences culture. So historical factors, I should say context there, not content. I reversed those two, and I apologize. But historical context, so the background information helpful to understanding the text. And then philosophical or content questions. So I like to say when people ask me that my teaching philosophy is historical, philosophical, and pedagogical. I like the sound of those terms. I think they do encapsulate what I mean, but they're not necessarily the most logical terms to choose right away. So content, context, content, and learning are three terms I substitute instead. If those first three aren't working well for you, you can think of context, content, and learning instead of historical, philosophical, pedagogical. But basically, we look at the history first, then we look at the content of the text itself, and then we looked at its influence. So, context, content, learning. In the next slide builds on this. So, when studying any piece of literature, and especially a piece of literature that's much older than what you're used to reading, like the ones in this class, and from a very different culture than your own culture, again, like the ones in this class, it can be hard at first to understand what the text is trying to say. And part of the purpose of a class like this is to give you the right tools so that you can interpret any piece of literature, any text from any time period or any culture, which is what I've learned to do in my profession. I have a specialty and I'm very good at interpreting text from a certain time period, but I teach text from all throughout history, from antiquity to the present. And I often encounter texts I've never read before. And why am I qualified to teach them? Well, in my years of training, I learned methodology for approaching any text. And this methodology is the basis of my teaching philosophy. And so from the teaching philosophy I showed you on the previous slide, we can derive 5 questions. And so the real trick to interpreting a piece of literature that seems very unfamiliar is to ask the right questions. And I think from my experience that these are the 5 most important questions. And as you can see with the phrases or terms in parentheses, they connect back to my teaching philosophy. So the first question I would say you should ask is, what do I need to know to understand this text? What is it about the history, the culture, the context surrounding it that would help me understand it better? All right, Greek literature doesn't make a lot of sense. It seems very odd unless you know something about Greek culture. The next one is the content question. So what is the theme, the message, the central idea of this text? We'll talk about theme more later in the lesson. Theme is a really important term when you're studying literature. A theme is the central message or idea of the text. The novel or the poem or the play's thesis statement, so to speak. What is the author trying to say? What is their point? So once we have some background and know how to interpret the text, we interpret it. We say, what is this about? What is it trying to say? The third part here is the learning, the pedagogical. Pedagogy is a term that means teaching, learning. So what can we learn from this text? What does it offer of value? Why does it matter? Why should we study it? I feel like way too often professors who teach literature pick the text and they know why they are important, and there's good reasons why they're important, but they don't convey those reasons to their students. They just teach the text, put them on the syllabus, and teach them. And I think we should inquire of any text we're reading, anything we read. Why am I reading this? Why does it matter that I'm reading this? What can I learn from this? So that you should always ask that question too. And so with these first 3 questions, you see the 2 sides of the teaching philosophy. With the first question is the culture influences literature. Then we interpret the literature itself, and then you see the other side of it, that the literature influences the culture. The last 2 questions are, I think, specifically helpful when you're studying these really different, much older or very different pieces of literature. There will always be things in the text that are unique or specific to that time and culture. Things that are only present in Greek texts that are not present in other texts. And here, again, we see the influence of the culture on the literature. But if we're reading a text like the ones reading this class, and technically these are considered masterpieces based on the title of the class, what makes it a masterpiece? What makes it classic literature? And what I've determined about that is universal themes. Themes are ideas that transcend the time period. Greek culture probably seems very strange to you, as it should. And there are things in the Iliad you would not find in other texts, but why has the Iliad been taught for 3,000 years, taught and studied and researched for 3,000 years? There are certain things about it that appeal to anyone, that anyone can relate to, and we'll get into those as we study. So, answering these 5 questions, I think, can help you understand any piece of literature better, no matter how foreign or odd it is. And again, this is coming from my teaching philosophy. I hope it's a tool that'll help you throughout this class. With all of that said, that's what I'm hoping is the background that will help you with this class. Um, and so now I'd like to dive into the actual content. Again, if you have any questions about what we just covered, please send me an email or stop by campus and see me. Before we get to the Iliad and Greek literature itself, I want to talk a little bit about the theme for the course. When you're studying a class like this, when you're in a class studying with this kind of structure, it's very easy to get disoriented. You can easily move from one week to the next 500 years ahead in time to a very different culture. So what is a universal theme, to relate back to the last slide, that can bring all of these texts together? And I've chosen the concept of cosmopolitanism as the theme for the class because I really do believe it does tie these texts together very nicely. So this section of the PowerPoint is pretty brief, and we're just going to unpack that short article I posted for you to read on cosmopolitanism and get kind of a basis for the theme of the class, and we'll use that theme as we go into the Iliad and study it later in the lesson. Give you kind of an idea of the format here. Like I talked about a few minutes ago, recall is the first thing we do. Usually I do this at the start of class every day when I'm teaching on campus. So the way it comes into play here is that we just do one lesson, one PowerPoint per week. But usually we'd be meeting 2 or 3 times if we were meeting on campus. So I'll usually have at least 1 or 2 recall slides throughout a PowerPoint with the PowerPoint divided into parts. And here, it would be helpful to recap what we just covered. And I think one of the most important things we just covered was succeeding in an online class. Since the online element is probably the most unique part of this class. So what I would recommend you do here is pause the lecture for a couple minutes and just jot down 3 strategies you think will help, that you plan to use to succeed in this class. I did list out 3 strategies, but I talked about a lot of other things. And ultimately, they can all relate back to helping you succeed in this particular online class. So you don't just have to write down the ones that I said, even if you remember them. Draw on anything I just said from that last set of slides and pick 3 things you can do that you think will really help you in this class. Excuse me. And then reading questions. So these are the questions that I posted to Canvas to help you as you read the article on cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism is a really complex concept that's been defined many different ways by many different scholars and philosophers and thinkers over the years. And it means something slightly different to different people, although there's a general kind of idea that drives it that we're going to talk about in a minute. So I'd recommend defining it in your own words, using your critical thinking skills and coming up with a good definition of cosmopolitanism. Anytime you deal with a term or concept that seems new or different, I would always recommend defining it in your own words, trying to write down that definition. If you can explain it in your own words and that explanation makes sense, then you've hit a home run. You've understood that concept. If you can't figure out how to explain it in your own words, or your explanation doesn't make sense, doesn't describe it well, you probably have to revisit that concept and work on understanding it better. It also might help to think of some examples. You may not have heard of the term cosmopolitanism before this class, but you probably saw it in action. So what might be some examples? Again, just things to help you understand cosmopolitanism better. Hopefully you thought about these as you were reading. So as I said, this is the theme for the course because I feel like it ties the pieces of literature together, the different time periods and cultures we're studying together nicely. It does date back to not quite the time we're reading, but just after that. An idea, a concept like cosmopolitanism, a philosophical, broad concept with significant implications like cosmopolitanism, an idea like that can exist well before anyone puts it into writing or comes up with a name for it. So the first text we're reading, the Iliad, is from about the 8th century BCE, and the first use of the term cosmopolitan is from the 3rd century BCE. But Since as long as people have existed and had grouped themselves into different tribes or nations, the concept of cosmopolitanism very well could have existed in people's heads, even if they didn't put a name to it until the 3rd century. But the philosopher Diogenes the Cynic was the first person. He didn't use the word cosmopolitan, but he evoked the idea when he said, I am a citizen of the world. And again, someone else before him could very well have had a similar thought. And from that, a series of thinkers in ancient Greece and Rome came up with the term cosmopolite, which is the root of cosmopolitan, and it means world citizen. And the most basic definition of cosmopolitanism would be believing that you belong to a world community rather than the place you were born. Uh, Cosmopolites view the location of their birth as an accident or a coincidence. Um, so you may be born in the U.S., and you can certainly be patriotic, but you would have a greater allegiance to a system of universal moral values that would override that. Um, so cosmopolitanism defies boundaries of race, class, social status, and even gender. Um, Really broad implications here in terms of it's not just a geographical thing. So um, essentially what this is when you have people who are from very different cultures, different classes of society coming together and seeing a connection, empathizing with each other, or seeing how, despite all these things on the surface that seem different, that we're all human and we really do have a connection or relationship to someone who seems very different from us. That's cosmopolitanism in a nutshell. Um, so again, it doesn't mean that you have to be unpatriotic or something like that. It just means that you believe there's a greater sense of humanity that all people have the potential to possess or do possess. Um, and I'm not arguing that everyone in the class should become a cosmopolitan, or that I myself, I don't even know if I would acknowledge as a cosmopolitan. But I do think it's a really important idea because it brings people together. And we're studying very different pieces of literature from very different time periods. And so recognizing the similarities, again, to come back to my teaching philosophy, recognizing the universal themes is kind of an example of cosmopolitanism. And since we'll be learning about all of these different countries and their cultures, that's a question we can ask of every single text is this text reflecting a more of a cosmopolitan view or a view that's very specific to that culture? And so, or both. Um, and so I think that's what makes it a good theme for the class is it's a question you can pose to any text we read. And if you have a theme that's guiding a class like this with all these different cultures and texts, you need a theme that can give you a question you can ask of each text. And so of each text in here, we can ask if we want to, does this text reflect cosmopolitan values or not? Um, and one last point I should make before we move on, I kind of mentioned already, is that it's not a geographical place. It's not a place where a physical place where people from all different countries and cultures gather together. It's more of an idea, um, a sense of kind of an invisible nation where everyone in the world can coexist, but not a physical place. Um, Cosmopolites certainly believe that we need local government and things like that to keep the world functioning, but at the same time, um, the cosmopolitan view of seeing everyone as having a universal humanity transcends that. So these are the learning questions. These are the questions that I'll put on the PowerPoint, or excuse me, on the discussion board, and you could answer any of these questions. You could pick one and answer it for your post. You're also more than welcome to pick a question from the Iliad, which we'll see those at the very end of the PowerPoint too. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these now. There are more questions for you to think about later, but I do also include them here. And I would say some things to think through are, what do you identify as? And again, I'm not pushing to become a cosmopolitan here. I'm not necessarily one myself, but I think it's an important thing to think through. What would you call your home? How does the place you call your home figure into the way you think of yourself? Um, how does cosmopolitanism influence human interactions? How does it impact the literary texts? And I said why I think it's a good theme for the class, but it'd probably be helpful for you to think through as well why it's a good theme for the class. So again, when we get to these slides, I'm not going to spend much time on them. With your discussion board post, I'd like you to take the discussion beyond what we've said in class. I don't want you to just repeat back to me what I've said in the lecture. I want you to think about those ideas and build on them. Take the discussion a step further. And so these questions are there to guide you, to help you to do that, to point you in a direction to do that. But I don't want to dwell on them too much now because I want to see what you can come up with. All right, so we're finally going to look at some literature. Again, I would expect the lessons more to be about half an hour typically because we'd be just focusing on the literature. Some weeks that might be longer when we're looking at several pieces of literature, but again, everything up to this point was background to introduce you to the class, the theme for the class, and now this is normally the point where we'd be starting in most lessons. And we're starting with the ancient Greeks, and in a few slides I'll explain why we're starting with the ancient Greeks. So the recall here, think about cosmopolitanism. What are some core principles of cosmopolitanism? Why is it a good theme for the class? We'll come back to this. Essentially, I'd ask you, is the Iliad a text that reflects any cosmopolitan values? And I said we could ask that about any text, which is why I chose it as the theme, but I think it's particularly interested with the Iliad because Greek society is not a society that seems very cosmopolitan initially. And Achilles is certainly a self-focused character that doesn't seem to care about other people. But it's a pretty interesting scene in the final scene of the novel. And you could certainly argue that, the poem, not the novel, I'm sorry. You could certainly argue that some kind of cosmopolitan thing happens in that final scene between Achilles and Priam. But it's so brief, you could certainly take the argument the other way. And so that's why I think it's an interesting question to pose. And we'll come back to it. So, especially in your discussion board posts, you can. So keep in mind, if you wrote down a definition of cosmopolitanism, if you paused the slides earlier and did that, that'd be great. If not, pause it now and jot down 3 or 4 core principles. And then later on we can test those principles, see if they apply to the Iliad. So as I've said before, I always start with the historical context. In this case, there's even more because we're looking at this background on the ancient world for the first time. So the textbook is divided into 3 sections, 3 time periods. They have fancy titles for them. For instance, this one is Ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern Literature. But these 3 time periods can roughly be called Antiquity, the medieval period, and the Renaissance. So antiquity goes from before the birth of Christ up to shortly after the birth of Christ, I guess you could say. And then after the birth of Christ, both Christianity and Islam spread throughout the Western world, and then we see the emergence of what scholars call the medieval period. And then eventually medieval values kind of die out, and what happens is the Renaissance. And that surveys about half of the history of Western civilization. It would take a whole nother class, a whole nother 10 weeks to go from the Renaissance to the present. So 3 times throughout the quarter, we'll have a little bit of extra historical context to go over the background of that time period, either antiquity, the Middle Ages, or the Renaissance. And so again, that's part of why this lecture is a little bit longer, so bear with me, but hopefully you find this information interesting and helpful. We're studying the ancient Greeks, and they were one of the first cultures to really have written language. Not the first, but one of the first. And so a lot of what we'll learn about in this historical context is how written language developed. But before written language, there was an oral tradition. which was very prominent in Greece because written language didn't come to Greece till around the 8th century BCE. And so before that, there was this prominent oral tradition. And almost every culture in the world has some kind of oral tradition. We all love media. We all love to be entertained. We love to watch movies or Netflix or read novels. And the people of the ancient world were the same way. They just didn't have that technology. So instead, they told stories. And if you go far enough back in any culture, you find an oral tradition. The difference is with when certain educational, technological developments happened in that culture, when and how influential the oral tradition is varies. um, and so from an oral tradition, we eventually emerged to written language. The earliest documents ever written down were mainly administrative lists. The oldest piece of text that we would call literature, and that term is very broad, so I mean basically that it tells a narrative, is the Epic of Gilgamesh, um, which is the first thing in our textbook and technically speaking the oldest piece of literature. It's an epic, much like the Iliad. We're not reading it in this class purely for the sake of time. I've taught it many times before in other classes, and it is fascinating, but with only 10 weeks, we can only cover so much, and I do think the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid are more interesting than Gilgamesh in terms of epic poems. But it's the oldest work of literature. It was written down in cuneiform in ancient Mesopotamia, which was a language very similar to hieroglyphics. And it was written on these 12 big tablets, and 11 of those tablets are still fairly well intact. And so that's where the translation of Gilgamesh that's in our textbook comes from. Um, and we'll talk more in a minute about what an epic poem is, but that's the oldest genre, the oldest style of literature, since Gilgamesh and the Iliad are two of the first pieces of literature. Um, Phoenician script is the oldest surviving ancient writing system, and by surviving, I mean that it still has an influence. Languages that still exist today can trace some of their roots back to Phoenician. Um, None of the languages that still exist today can really be traced back to cuneiform. So that'd be the difference between cuneiform and Phoenician script. And again, cuneiform was more like hieroglyphics, whereas Phoenician script, part of the reason why it still has an influence is that it did have an actual alphabet. But at the same time, they didn't have vowels, which, as you know from the English language, are really pretty essential. So through trade, and a lot of the things we're reading in this class are very influenced by trade. Um, it's not like today where you can order something off the internet. So people had to sell, they had to travel. Certain goods, certain things they needed were only available in a different country, not in their own country. So they had to travel and exchange things that other people needed and didn't have for things they needed from those people that they didn't have themselves. And so, again, thinking of cosmopolitanism, a lot of these ancient cultures came into contact that way. And they would share, when they traded their goods, they would also share their stories, their oral traditions. And eventually the Phoenician script traveled to Greece. And Greece existed for a long time before the 8th century BCE and had its own very prominent oral tradition. But when the Phoenician script arrived, the Greeks added vowels to it, and Greek became one of the first, written languages that we can still really trace the roots of today. And that's when Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, was around the 8th century BCE. Once the Greeks had that Phoenician script and added vowels and had a language they could write down, they immediately started putting their oral tells they'd been telling for centuries onto parchment, and that's when Homer, and we don't know much about Homer or anything about him really, but that's when he composed the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so now we're going to transition from, so that was the information you would need to really understand the whole ancient world, the whole time of antiquity. We're only looking at the Greeks and the Romans. If we had more time, we could look at the Egyptians or Mesopotamia or some other places from antiquity. But that background information that should hopefully be helpful to kind of understanding that period of time. Now we're going to look more specifically at the Greeks, Homer, and the Iliad. As I mentioned before, ancient Greece didn't seem like much of a cosmopolitan society because it was highly fragmented. It was one country, but it was made up of these small independent city-states. that were kind of like their own little countries. They were, even though they were all Greek, they were very different from each other. Some examples you might be familiar with, you may have learned about in school before in history class, are Sparta and Athens. If you've seen the movie 300, you know the 300 Spartans battle the Persian army. So Sparta was known as this warrior culture with its massive land army, whereas Athens had a large navy, but was really considered more of a center of philosophy and learning. So two very different city-states within the same Greek country culture, really very different cultures within a larger Greek culture, illustrates how highly fragmented Greek society was, and why it's so interesting to pose the question of cosmopolitanism to this culture. Um, the Greek word polis means city, and that's part of the root of cosmopolitan. Cosmopolitan, if you look at the roots, it means universal city. So we can see how eventually, later on, after Homer, the term cosmopolitan grew out of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. As I mentioned on the last slide, there was a really prominent, thriving oral tradition in Greece before they had written language. And this becomes very important to understanding the Iliad and the Odyssey, and is part of what makes studying the Iliad and the Odyssey so different from studying something we'd read today. You probably know a lot of things about the Trojan War. You probably know about Achilles' heel. You probably know about the Trojan horse. You probably know about Helen, the face who launched 1,000 ships, and that the Greeks went to Troy to get her back. But none of those events are actually depicted in the Iliad. The Iliad mainly tells the story of Achilles in his journey, what he goes through during part of the last year of the Greek war with the Trojans. So all of those things you've heard of before, Helen, the Trojan horse, those were part of the Greek oral tradition. Thousands of different people were telling this story, the Greek war with the Trojans, over and over again for centuries before Homer wrote it down. So Homer just writing down one version of it, his version of it, and he knows that his audience, his readers, would be familiar with the Trojan horse and things like that. So he doesn't need to mention it, but he can reference it in passing, and his audience would know what he meant. So that creates kind of this gap where it can be hard to understand. Homer might make references to things that we don't know what he's talking about, but his audience would have, and he depicts things aren't present in the Iliad that we might expect to be there because of kind of our general knowledge of Greek culture. But again, his audience would have been so familiar with that, he had no reason to put it in there. So this oral tradition and Homer creating like really the first piece based out of this oral tradition is one of the things that makes Greek society very different from our own. This oral tradition that told the story of the Greek war with the Trojans, it wasn't really telling real events. They were very loosely based on real conflicts that did take place between the Greeks and parts of Asia Minor, but the specific 10-year-long war with the Trojans wasn't a real specific actual battle that happened. It was this, mythological tale that arose in the oral tradition, out of kind of just some general knowledge of these number of conflicts that had happened. So it's somewhat historical, but very loosely based on real history. So you can say that the world of Homer, the world he creates in the Iliad, is neither purely historical nor purely fictional, which means that it is loosely based on history, but in many ways it's more like fiction than history. Yet at the same time, it's not solely fiction, not solely history. And I think this really is why it's great to start with the Iliad, because that's what literature does. You have things like historical fiction, but ultimately those are always closer to fiction than history. And things that parade themselves as nonfiction or biography, we always pose the question, did this really happen this way? So the lines between fiction and history get blurred anytime we study any type of literature. And going back to one of the oldest texts here, Homer illustrates that better than anyone else. The way he drew on the oral tradition that was very loosely based on historical events, but created his own fictional world. And at the same time, you can read nonfiction, you can read fiction. It can become hard to tell the difference, but ultimately, what matters is that fiction literature tells us great truths about the world. We can learn from it. We also can learn from the mistakes. You shouldn't try to emulate what Achilles does, but we can learn a lot about human nature from seeing Achilles' mistakes. And so that line is always blurred between history and fiction when you study literature. And it helps illustrate why studying literature is so important. Again, back to that idea of pedagogy or learning. We can learn something from these texts, even though they're mainly fictional. So you see here the two sides of my teaching philosophy in action in the Iliad. Homer drawing on this oral tradition, we see the influence of culture on literature or on Homer because that existed before and he was able to draw on it and use it. At the same time, he creates this world that preserves this tradition. Because it's an oral tradition, once people die out and stop telling the stories, it could just go away. But because Homer wrote down the stories, they're still around. We're studying them today, 3,000 years later. So, in that sense, Homer also had a vast influence on culture for the second half of my teaching philosophy. That's represented there. He created a tale that preserved a previous tradition and had a lasting influence. The last thing I'll add is what an epic poem is. An epic poem is a very long poem that tells a story much like a novel. So you're technically reading poetry, but because we have a translation that's made easy for 21st century English speaking readers, it reads much more like a novel than a poem. But it is technically poetry, and if you were able to read it in the original Greek, it would have more of a poetic feel to it. And an epic poem usually has a big protagonist like Achilles or Odysseus or Gilgamesh or Aeneas. That's kind of an exaggeration of the prototypical individual from that culture. And they usually go on a journey where they learn something about themselves. And certainly Odysseus does. We can debate whether Achilles does or not. We'll get into that as we look at the text. So, again, there's a little bit extra historical context this time that wouldn't normally be there. This lesson's much longer than the others, and that's because the Iliad is a long, complex story that relates a lot of events, but also draws on this oral tradition that existed around it. And we're not able to read the whole thing. It would take several weeks, and we've got too many things to read. We can only really spend 1 week on it. What's nice in our textbook is that our textbook has the most significant chapters, or they're more like chapters, but it calls them books, and it has the most significant ones, but we can't even read all of those, and it doesn't have all of them. But in between them, it has these little summaries of what happens in between them. So if we were to read everything in the textbook, we'd get the most significant chapters and summaries of what happens in between. So even though I've only assigned 3 books out of the 6 or 7 that are there, I would still recommend you read all those summaries. And I would even recommend you look up a summary online. Things like Spark Notes are not bad things to use. If you're only reading the Spark Notes and not also reading the actual literature, then that'd be a problem. But literature, especially old literature from a very different culture, is hard to understand. So if after you read it, you go and look at the Spark Notes and that enhances your understanding, that's great. I do that myself sometimes. So, and especially with a text like this where we're only reading 3 out of 24 books, I would say you can follow my summary here, but it might help you to just look up a summary online too. But I'm going to try my best to summarize the plot for you here to help you. So these first events happen in Greek folklore legend and mythology in the oral tradition. They don't actually happen in the Iliad, but you need to know what these events are to understand the plot. So in the Greek oral tradition, Zeus, who's the king of the gods, appoints Paris of Troy to judge which goddess out of three is the most beautiful. One of the three goddesses, Aphrodite, bribes him into picking her by promising him Helen, um, who is Zeus's daughter from when Zeus mated with a human, and is considered the most beautiful woman in the world. So this is very tempting to Paris, and he picks Aphrodite, and then he believes it's his right to take Helen. So the Trojans go to Greece pretending to be on a diplomatic mission, but that's just a cover so that Paris can kidnap Helen and take her back to Troy. She's already married to a Greek named Menelaus, who is the brother of Agamemnon, who is the leader of the Greek military. So that's why they call Helen the face that launched 1,000 ships. To recover her, the Greeks go to Troy. They fight there for 10 years. And where the Iliad starts is in the 10th year of the war. The war is almost over, and the Iliad takes place over the course of just a few months. So we don't see the beginning or even the end of the war, even though these events technically happen very close to the end of the war. Some other things you need to know that aren't necessarily mentioned directly in the Iliad but are part of the oral tradition is that Thetis, Achilles' mother, who is a goddess, his father is mortal, his mother's a goddess. As you just saw in the Helen example, that happens a lot. We're going to talk more about the gods in a minute. She foretells that he will gain glory and die early. It's a prophecy. The Greeks were a very fatalistic culture that really believed in prophecy, and you had to follow through on your destiny and not defy it. But Achilles does get a choice. He can either die young and be renowned and famous and have all this glory, or he can be obscure and live a long life and die as an old man. And he obviously chooses the glory, as you can tell from the text, and the early death. But that's certainly informing his decision. His decision to stay out of the battle is informed by this, in addition to his feud with Agamemnon. He's eventually killed by Paris' arrow, which strikes his heel. You probably heard of that before, the phrase Achilles' heel. Again, this is the very end of the war, so it's not actually depicted in the Iliad. It's just from the oral tradition. But Thetis wanted Achilles to be immortal like her, so she dipped him in a river Styx, but she held onto his ankle so the water didn't touch his ankle, and that's his one vulnerable spot, which makes Achilles not a god, but a very godlike character. And that's part of why he's this extreme exaggeration, this extremely prideful character. The Greeks eventually win the war when Odysseus develops the Trojan horse strategy. Again, you're probably familiar with this. They pretend to have left and, given up their siege of Troy and offer this horse as a gift. And because Troy was known for having these huge impenetrable walls, no one could get inside. And so that means, because the Trojans think it's a gift, they take it inside, and the Greek army's waiting in there, and they come out and slaughter the Trojans. And all of these events happen because of the gods. The Paris example is the best example, right? He would not have gone and kidnapped Helen on his own if not for this little contest that, he's placed in by Zeus and then bribed by Aphrodite. And every significant event in the Iliad and Odyssey can be traced back to the gods. We don't have time to go into each one now. The Paris example is the best one. And this is very different from how it's depicted in the movies. The Troy movie from the early 2000s with Brad Pitt, that's based on the Iliad, basically makes it like Paris and Helen are in love, and doesn't acknowledge the gods at all, which is not the case at all in Homer's Iliad. And so what that does is it misrepresents Greek culture, because the gods were so influential. And we'll talk more about the gods in a minute. But they, again, kind of like the oral tradition and Homer basing his work on this oral tradition, the gods being so influential in this culture is something unique to that culture. These gods are very different from the kind of god we usually think about in present-day Western culture, and in many ways, but one way in which is how much they interfere with people's lives. Okay, so now these are the events that actually happen in the Iliad. Um, so again, it's 10 years into the war. The war is almost over, but not quite. Um, After a victory, Agamemnon takes Chryses as a spoil of war. So women were not treated well in this society, which is something we can talk about more later. But basically, they were treated as property, and so the movie depicts Brad Pitt's Achilles as being in love with this woman, but he's not. Achilles is not in love with her. It's a prize, a trophy, a spoil of war. Um, and so Agamemnon takes Chryses after this battle, and Achilles takes Brises. But Chryses' father is a priest, and he prays to the god Apollo for the return of his daughter. So Apollo sets a plague upon the Greek army and demands Agamemnon release Chryses, and he has to. And Achilles, if you read book one, goads him into it. Um, but then Agamemnon's so enraged by that, he takes Achilles' prize, Brises, from him. And this sets off Achilles. Oh boy, does he get mad. So these characters are both very prideful. Agamemnon and Achilles, especially Achilles, since he's part god or almost god. He is very prideful. And so he feels like his honor, his pride has been wounded by Agamemnon here. And so he refuses to fight, and he's the Greeks' best warrior. The Trojans fear him because he's this godlike individual. And so they really lose morale and they start losing. But even then, he also prays to his mother, who's a goddess, and to um, asks her to help the Trojans. So he not only does he withhold himself from battle, he also asks for the gods to help the other side win against his own side because he's that mad about Agamemnon wounding his pride by taking his prize. He's very like a child whose toy has been taken. And that all is outlined in book one, which is why I had you read book one, because it really sets up the story. It illustrates Achilles' pride, um, and how pride is such a central part of Greek culture. In book nine, which I did not assign, Odysseus tries to convince Achilles to return to the war. Um, and that's a very important part. Odysseus is a soldier, and he eventually becomes the main character in the next poem we'll read, Homer's Odyssey, which is after the Trojan War about Odysseus trying to travel home. So we see him just briefly in the Iliad, but he's known for being great at speaking and interacting with people, and so Agamemnon sends him to try to convince Achilles to rejoin the war because the Greeks are losing without Achilles there. And at that point, Agamemnon has swallowed his pride because he knows he needs Achilles in the war and is willing to offer him anything. He'll give him Briseis back. He'll give him any woman he wants, any city he wants, anything he wants. But Achilles is so prideful. He still refuses to rejoin the war. Um, Patroclus is Achilles' closest friend. And to boost the morale, he thinks if he wears Achilles' armor, he can return to battle and the Greek soldiers will think it's Achilles back in battle, and that'll lift their spirits and help them win. And because Achilles is so prideful and still doesn't want to rejoin the war, he approves of Patroclus' plan. But Patroclus is killed by Hector, the best warrior for the Trojans. And this outrages Achilles even more. And eventually, the reason why he goes back into the war. So, Achilles is so prideful, he won't go back in the war to help his troops, but Patroclus is his closest friend. He loves Patroclus so much that when Patroclus is killed, he actually does go back into the war. And so the gods fashion new armor for him, and the war immediately starts going better for the Greeks. Um, and you have a lot that comes up here that has to do with burial rites. Um, so we've noted a few points that were unique to Greek culture. Um, the oral tradition, the influence of the gods. Pride is such an important quality, and it's a little bit different understanding of pride from how we think of it today. So we'll talk about that more too. And a fourth important thing to note, so you might want to pause it here and note those four things: the oral tradition, the influence of the gods, the importance of pride, and now the importance of burial rites. A proper burial was very important to the Greeks because if someone wasn't buried properly, their spirit wouldn't go to Hades, the afterlife. The Greeks didn't believe in heaven and hell. Everyone went to the same place when they died, which is another way their culture is unique and different from ours. But um, getting to Hades, getting to that one place of afterlife was very important. And if proper burial rites weren't performed, then the soul didn't make it there and was trapped. And so Achilles wants to retrieve Patroclus' body. So if you read book 22, like I assigned in the reading, you see that Achilles wins that fight um, and celebrates and gets Patroclus' body back. But he's so angry, he's so mad because he's so prideful that Hector killed his friend, even though Hector is just, trying to help his side win the war. And it's not necessarily personal for him. Achilles makes it very personal, and he takes Hector's body and defiles it. And drags it around on his chariot, which is really depressing for Hector's parents. Priam, the king of Troy, is Hector's father. And so they really want Hector's body back. And this is the end of the poem, the last book, book 24, that I also asked you to read. Because Achilles is so prideful. He won't give the body back. But eventually, Priam comes to see him, and he does give him the body back. And the two have this moment, which is why I asked you to read book 24, where they interact, Achilles and Priam, and there's a connection. Priam gets Achilles to think about his own father, who is human, and Achilles is away from him right now at the war, and how his father's probably missing him. And that, in part, evokes him to be willing to give Priam Hector's body, which, as I said a few minutes ago, is so significant. So these events are precipitated by the gods. The gods do command Achilles to give Hector's body back. But there's still that moment of recognition there between Achilles and Priam. So you could argue that this is all precipitated by the gods, and Achilles hasn't undergone any kind of growth or change. And you could make that argument. But you could also make the argument that Achilles and Priam have a moment of cosmopolitan recognition there between each other, and that does play a role in Achilles' decision. As I mentioned before, the Greeks are this very fatalistic culture, and Achilles would not be able to defy the gods. He would be greatly punished if he went against them and did not give the body back. But they do have free will. He could technically defy the gods if he wanted to. And there can certainly be more factors besides just the command of the gods to give the body back and to give them time to mourn properly before continuing on with the war. So it's a very interesting moment. And as I said before, the epic is a story that is a character's journey. And sometimes, like in the Odyssey, it's a physical journey, but it's also a psychological journey too. And so later epics like the Odyssey and the Aeneid from Rome, it's even more of a psychological journey, and the protagonist goes through even more growth and change. And you can make the argument that Achilles doesn't go through much change here, but you can also make the argument that he does go through some change and some growth here. And you can have it either way. And so I think that's what makes it such an interesting topic to debate. So technically speaking, what we just covered would be all of the historical background, at least in terms of how I typically structure my lessons. But in talking about the plot and outlining the entire plot of the Iliad for you, so that you would really have a good understanding of the full text and the full oral tradition, or as much of it as possible, surrounding the text, we covered a lot of the important content that we would normally cover in this section. And, I don't want any of your lessons to typically be this long and keep you this long. So I'm going to try to wrap it up fairly quickly here. And again, just like the learning questions that we'll get to in a minute, it's always good to just kind of look at these questions, even if we don't spend a ton of time on them in the PowerPoint. So the reading questions that I posted to Canvas for you for the Iliad had to do with Achilles' character. He's so different from a protagonist we'd see today. He's so prideful. We mentioned Greek pride earlier. Greek pride, pride has a very negative connotation often in our culture. And it's certainly not necessarily a positive thing here with Achilles, but the Greeks did see it as very important. pride and honor were very closely connected for the Greeks. And so for Achilles, having his prize taken from him or having his friend killed really wounds his pride. He considers it like he's been disgraced or someone has treated him dishonorably. Because he's part God, he's more prone to the kind of childish behavior the gods often display. He really lashes out. So those would be some ways that he's very different. But I would challenge you to think of ways that he may be similar. Why would we study him? In what ways can you relate to him? Certainly the loss of a close friend, even if we wouldn't react the way he does, is something more universal there. The other reading question I asked you to consider was, what is a theme? Theme is one of the most important things, and correspondingly, what are some themes in the Iliad? But theme is one of the most important concepts you can learn when studying literature, because as I said earlier, it's the central message, the main idea the author is trying to convey in a literary text. So it's not plot. People often think the theme is the plot. That's not the case. It's it's the message, what the author is trying to say, what the text is about. So another question might help you to, if you didn't do it while you were reading, to pause here and jot down is, what are some themes from the Iliad? And I have some on the next slide. So again, normally we'd spend a little more time on these reading questions, but we've covered so much of it already when going through the plot that I'm going to go ahead and go on to the philosophical or content questions. So ideally, these are questions that would help you think of the theme, get at what the work is about. Which characters in the Iliad are the most sympathetic? And again, you could pause it here and try to answer these questions yourself if you want to. Might be a good way to think through the text, but it's hard not to like a character like Hector or to relate to Priam. And it can be hard to relate to Achilles or to sympathize with him. But he's the main character that we follow, so that's kind of an interesting, problematic thing to think through. The gods here are very problematic. They're very different from the kind of God one thinks of or sees in a Judeo-Christian tradition that's such an integral part of Western culture from the Middle Ages on. But this predates the emergence of that tradition. And usually in a Judeo-Christian tradition, the god is someone to look up to emulate even, whereas the gods here really can be very despicable characters. They rape people. They just act on their whims. They act very childish. You could say that Achilles is very childish, and he's nearly a god. And so a lot of his behaviors that we not fond of or that make him less sympathetic to us than other characters is because he's more godlike and less human. And godlike almost carries a negative connotation in this culture, at least looking at this culture through a 21st century lens. The Greeks had to revere and respect the gods because they believed that if they didn't, the gods would rain their fury down upon them. So it's just a very different understanding of what a god is from probably what a majority of you, though maybe not all of you, think of today. So going back to themes, some of the themes we do see here are rage, wrath, time, honor, and glory. Achilles directs the timing of events in the text by holding himself out of the war. The Greeks start losing when he's not in the war, and they start doing better when he rejoins it. So he controls time to a certain extent here, which is an interesting idea to explore. And he does that because of his rage. And he also unleashes his wrath because of his rage. So Achilles really precipitates everything that happens in the text. He controls time, and his rage and his wrath help him do that. Honor and glory are very important here. Achilles chooses to go back into battle in part to avenge Patroclus, but also in part because he wants the glory of that's promised to him. He wants to be renowned for his deeds. He doesn't want to die in obscurity, so he chooses to die young and live gloriously. and characters are very, very honorable. Achilles feels like his honor has been wounded when his prize is taken from him and when his friend is killed. Hector also feels that it would be dishonorable not to um, battle Achilles. The gods again trick him into it, but there's always that dual element. Everything happens because of the gods. The gods are never not involved in an event, but a character also brings their own perceptions to it. So Athena tricks Hector into going back into battle with Achilles, but he still wants to, even though he knows he'll die, because he feels like it would be dishonorable to his troops, the men he's led in war, for him to not stand his ground there. So there's always that human element that comes into it. And in a way, Hector's more sympathetic because he's less godlike than Achilles, and the gods aren't positive characters here. We talked about the importance of Hector's body to his parents already. Um, and Priam is not able to properly grieve until they have that body back. And so you could argue that grief is very important to the Greeks. Grief plays such a psychological role for all human beings. When we lose someone, in order to move on and live a healthy life, we have to grieve properly. And so for the Greeks, they couldn't do that unless they knew that the person had gone on to the afterlife. And again, um, Hector's soul wouldn't go to the afterlife until Priam got the body back and took the 12 days to do the proper funeral rites. And the gods just tell Achilles that he needs to give the body back, but Achilles, after his conversation with Priam, agrees to give him the 12 days for the proper burial rites and to not attack and resume the war until after that, which he doesn't necessarily have to do that. So that is a very interesting part of their conversation. Another slide I'll always have on here that I haven't mentioned yet is close reading. If we were studying this in a class, we would probably take time during our discussion to look at specific passages of language from the text. We won't always be able to do that here. In other lessons where the lesson's not nearly as long as this one, which should be most of them, maybe I'll see if we can do it, but I'll try to stop and read some passages and analyze them. But as I mentioned before, close reading is such an important part of the class. You want to look at actual language from the text and use it when proving your arguments in your papers and your discussion board posts. So I always try to have at least a few passages from the text that are very important on the slide. And since I asked you to read 3 books from the Iliad, I have one here from each book. The first one here really gives a lot about Achilles' character. The second one is what I just talked about, that internal struggle with Hector where he's deciding to go back in to battle, and how that's an honorable choice. And then the last one is that great conversation between Achilles and Priam. So if you're really interested in any of those parts of the book or any of the ideas I just mentioned, though, you might want to revisit those passages, or there's certainly passages you could use in your discussion board posts or your papers. And finally here we have the learning questions. Again, especially because I've taken so much time, but also in general, these are the questions you can answer on Canvas, so we're not going to spend much time on them. You can either answer a question from the Cosmopolitan slide earlier or a question from this Iliad slide here. And with the exception of a few weeks where we just read one text, I'll usually have 2 sets of questions, and you can pick one question from either set. You don't have to answer more than one question. Just pick one question. So I'll just give you some nuggets real briefly to help you with that. The Iliad is full of speeches, and the actual battle scenes are very brief. So why is that? Rhetoric, communicating, speaking well was certainly important to the ancient Greeks, but it might help you to think through that some more. Do the characters have free will? We already talked about that some with talking about the gods, but that's a question we can always pursue with the Greeks. We talked about honor and glory earlier, so connecting those to the motives of specific characters now, like Hector and Achilles, would be a fruitful task. And then, does Achilles' character change? It's not a super significant change, but this is a story about his journey. I mentioned that earlier as well. So does he seem less prideful at the end? And to go along with that, is that the final question here, is that moment between he and Priam, is that really a moment of cosmopolitanism or not? I think these things are debatable and they're interesting to debate. So I'll really look forward to reading what you have to say about them in the discussion board. And then one last slide. Every single PowerPoint will end with this slide. Pedagogical implications. This is taking the pedagogical questions, asking what did I learn from this text, and answering it, saying this is what I have learned. And I like to just leave you with 2 questions there. And they go back to those 5 initial questions I asked earlier, or that I said you should ask of any literary text. So in addition to saying, what do I need to know about this text? What is it telling me? What do I learn from it? You can also ask, what is specifically unique to the culture of this time? So certainly the gods, the oral tradition, pride, the burial rites, but also what are the universal themes? What are the things that transcend this culture that anyone can relate to? And so certainly wanting to be able to grieve, mourning the loss of a friend, um, the horrors of war. Hopefully there are other ones. This is always the slide where I have 2 question marks with no text around them, because that's what I'm hoping you'll do in the discussion board is start with my question, but then in answering my question, take the discussion further and tell me what you learned from the text that maybe I don't know myself. I always feel like I learn something from students when I teach this class. So teach me something in your discussion board posts. Tell me what you've learned from this text. Um, and that's what makes teaching a class like this so fun. So again, the last portion here, the last half an hour or so, is what you'll typically get in a lesson looking at the literary text. But hopefully all of that background at the start was helpful for you in being prepared to succeed in this class. Please email me if you have questions about everything. I'm very excited to work with you and want you to succeed in this class. So email me with any questions at all. I really look forward to reading your posts and enjoying the discussions with you.